the Lizardmen. This ancient race of reptiles have known war longer than most, and that experience has turned their kin into utter killing machines. They're one of the toughest and hardest hitting factions out there, but alas, their weaknesses are also apparent. Without the proper care and attention, they'll become a horde of mindless savages. So we shall dive deep into the Lizardmen paradigms and how they roll out on the battlefield. This guide is about how the Lizardmen play in battle, whether that be in campaign or online. Now, let us begin. So, what the hell are the Lizardmen's main strengths and weaknesses? Well, it should come as no surprise on the first one. Dinosaurs are the biggest strength of the Lizardmen, of course. Mighty beasts that can run rampant all over the battlefield, causing terror all over the place, and that are very difficult to stop. However, for all this power and ferocity, there is a massive downside, and that is that they're liable to lose their shit and go into rampage, meaning they'll become uncontrollable and will do whatever the hell they want. An affliction that plagues most of the Lizardmen army. Lucky for them though, they actually have fantastic endurance and staying power. Tons of health, high armor and high leadership means it's difficult to win a war of attrition against the Lizardmen. However, despite their staying power, they're not a faction that will do a lot of damage quickly, as most of their army doesn't have great melee attack. This is more of a passive weakness and not really something you need to worry about too much, but it's important to realise that the Lizardmen aren't going to chew through their enemies really quickly with high damage. One last thing the Lizardmen have going for them is a vast amount of healing options, further adding to their endurance and staying power and ability to outlast their enemy. And the last downside for the Lizardmen is that their army is very expensive, meaning you'll end up with small armies online that are susceptible to being flanked, or very expensive full stacks in campaign. So these I believe to be the main strengths and weaknesses of the Lizardmen army. Get to know them whether playing as or against the Lizardmen. Now, onto the roster, where I'll give a brief explanation of each unit and what their role is within the army and anything else of significance. So, what area of the army should we begin with? How about... The Saurus Oldblood is your first and cheapest lord choice, but he by no means reflects a cheap unit. His stats are actually pretty damn good. He's an armor-piercing melee lord who actually isn't far dissimilar from Kroq-Gar. He actually has higher melee defense than Kroq-Gar and a bronze shield, saying that he's a better survivor than Kroq-Gar is. He'll take less damage overall, but he won't dish out as much as Kroq-Gar does. He can mount up on a cold one to make him a bit more mobile, or onto a Carnosaur to make him anti-large. Ultimately, he's probably the better choice over Kroq-Gar if you just want to save some money. And then we've got the big lizard man himself, Kroq-Gar. As I mentioned, he's a similar deal to the Saurus Oldblood, he's just a bit more powerful and capable of putting out more damage. He's also anti-large as well as armor piercing, so it makes him great against those large lords. He's got a couple of abilities which can aid both his damage output and his defense, and has a few mount options available, most notably the Carnosaur, which is where you've probably seen Kroq-Gar most of the time, especially if you play online, where he can be an absolute nightmare just like the Saurus Oldblood on a Carnosaur. It'll make him very difficult to stop, and the anti-large bonus of the Carnosaur will wreak havoc on the large units. So those are your two melee lord choices. If you want to save some money, the Saurus Oldblood's probably the better choice. If you want the most damaging, death-dealing, killing power in a melee fight, then Kroq-Gar is obviously going to be the way to go. But if you're saying, Zerk, I don't like big brutish melee lizards. I'm a man of the arcane. Well, that's fine. We got some big fat magic lizards for you as well. You can choose from the High, Light or Heavens lorebook from each of the Slann Mage priests. So you can of course choose whichever one you like to best complement your build. They're of course not fantastic in melee, so may need a good bit of protection. If you want the ultimate force in the magic world though, Lord Mazdamundi is going to be your go-to choice. He's got various spells from different spellbooks, and a few unique spells of his own, such as the Ruination of Cities. If you like his particular combination of spells, he's probably going to be your go-to magic choice, especially as you can't get the high or light magic books in any of your heroes. And again, as he's a wizard, he's not that great in melee, so you will need to be careful with him. Unless you put him on his ancient Stegodon mount, and then he's terrifying. It's also worth noting that every single one of these lords has a healing spell called Cold Blooded, which is very useful for healing themselves or allied troops. Your first hero choice is the Skink Chief. He's not great in melee, he could maybe get after some light skirmishers, but for the most part he'll want to avoid the melee. His strength is his long range missile damage, which is pretty high, and poison as well, so it's going to make him great at taking down enemy characters, Very often you'll see him put on a pterodon, flown in the air, staying out the way, and just hammering away at enemy characters and picking them off. He can also be put on stegodons, but to be honest it doesn't really make too much difference to any of the stats, so it's probably not really worth it. Best used as a mobile harassing assassin. The Saurus Scar Veteran is your one and only melee hero choice. He's pretty powerful and has good defenses with a shield and high melee defense, as well as an anti-large bonus with armor piercing. So he's going to be great at taking down large characters or helping with those large units. I'd say he's pretty much an essential bodyguard as well if you either bring a Slan Mage Priest or Lord Mazdamundi. He can help deal with any characters that try to get after them. He has a couple of mount options, and again, the Carnosaur is one of them, making him very difficult to stop and has that anti-large killing power. And lastly, we have the two different skink priests, one of beasts and one of heavens. Of course, choose whichever one best fits your needs, and as always, keep them out of the melee, they will get their heads kicked off. Putting them on various mounts could make them more useful and harassing around the map. Skink Cohort, the closest thing the Lizardmen have to an expendable unit. There's a lot of them and they have a shield so they can soak up some damage in missiles, but they're not going to do a great deal of damage when in melee. Their true strength though is their speed. They're going to be one of the best flanking units for you, so they can get round and try and get after missile units and other low tier infantry, things that they'll do okay against. Definitely not a frontline unit, going to be best off harassing the enemy or trying to get after those missiles. And then you've got your cheapest anti-large choice, Saurus Spears. Not a great deal different in attack and defense to most cheap spear units, although they do have higher weapon damage than most cheap units. But their strength is their toughness. Their high health, high armor and high leadership mean they're not going to be an easy unit to get rid of whichever way you slice it. Going to of course be great for taking down the larger units, although they don't have a shield, so you'll want to watch out against factions with good missiles. If you want something a bit more damaging, our first proper infantry is Saurus Warriors. Much like all the other Saurus units, they have great armor, great health and great leadership, and Saurus Warriors have really high weapon strength, meaning they can dish out a lot of damage potentially. One place all these Saurus Warriors fall short though, as I mentioned earlier, their melee attack isn't actually that great. It's below average at 28. Even Empire Swordsmen have 32. So don't expect Saurus Warriors to chew through enemy front lines very quickly, but they will be able to do plenty of damage just over a long period of time. They're kind of a combination of a holding unit and a damage dealer unit, in their own weird way. And then we've got Saurus Spears with shields, who, you've guessed it, they're pretty much the same as the other Saurus Spears, they just have a shield to protect them from missiles, and a slightly higher melee defense. So when making the choice on whether to shield or not to shield, think about the enemy missiles and whether they're a threat to you. And then Saurus Warriors with shields, the same deal as the Spears with shields of course. If you got missiles coming your way, you may want to bring the shielded version. And these boys are probably the single best choice for a frontline unit, as they have the melee defense for holding and the weapon strength to do some damage. The big downside to all these Saurus units though is Rampage. They may lose control if they take damage too quickly, and you won't be able to give them any orders, so always be aware of that. And lastly, your one and only proper elite unit, the Temple Guard, are your top melee infantry. They're primarily an anti-large unit with their bonus versus large, and they're the only armor piercing infantry you have. They've got a ton of staying power and can dish out damage, but are ultimately very expensive and not really affordable as a front line. I'd say their primary role is dealing with elite large units. You also don't have to worry about Rampage with the Temple Guard, as they are far more disciplined than those brutish Saurus Warriors. Another note to make is that all these Saurus Warriors have predatory senses, which is great for revealing hidden units around the map a little bit sooner. Onto our missiles, with the first choice being Skink Cohort with Javelins. Now these are very much just Skink Cohort, to be honest. Think of them as just a regular melee infantry version of Skink Cohort. They just have a few javelins. They don't have very much ammunition, so it literally is a few javelins. So same idea as the melee version, flanking round and shooting the enemy front line in the back with those poison javelins could be a good call, and when they're out of ammo, get them chasing after missile units maybe. And then your first proper dedicated missile unit, you can tell this by their terrible melee stats, Skink Skirmishers are a little more handy at range. While they don't have a great deal of range, they can fire whilst moving and fire in any direction, so they're great at kiting the enemy. And as they're very quick on their feet, they're great at staying out of danger, except against cavalry and things of course. They have poison missiles and vanguard deployment, so they can be pretty sneaky, nifty little units. Best off as a flanker trying to sneak behind the enemy, because they really don't have the range to sit behind your front line. And then in a similar vein, Chameleon Skinks are even more nifty. They have the Vanguard deployment, but they also have Chameleon, which basically means stalk, so they can move undetected until very close. They also do way more damage than Skink Skirmishers and can still fire in all directions whilst moving, and their melee stats are significantly better, although still not great. However, their unit size is smaller than Skink Skirmishers, so the damage will probably even out. Chameleon Skinks are going to be your best choice for an ambush more than anything. And one of the biggest things they have going for them is the fact that they're wearing a toad as a hat. Cavalry now, and Feral Cold Ones are your first cavalry style unit choice. Primarily going to be a flanking unit as they're very quick, have good armor to bounce those missiles off, unless they're armor piercing ones of course, with also nice armor piercing weapon strength and a charge bonus. They fall down in their melee attack and melee defense though, so don't expect them to survive very well, but if you charge them in, they'll get that charge bonus which will add on to their melee attack, thus meaning they can do a lot more damage. So flank round on engaged elite units and they'll do a nice bit of armor piercing damage to help out your Saurus warriors. I'd say try and cycle charge them as much as possible, but to be honest they go into rampage so easily because of their low health, they're kind of a fire and forget unit. And then your first proper cavalry unit is Cold One Riders, who are very much the same as Feral Cold Ones to be honest, but with a nice boost to their leadership and stat improvements all across the board, and no rampage to worry about. They are a shock cavalry really, with their low melee defense and low melee attack and a nice charge bonus, so get them behind the enemy front line and charge them in to drop some armor piercing damage on those heavily armoured units, lest your front line struggle against heavy armour. So if you want a budget hammer and anvil cavalry, Cold One Riders are the best choice. And then you have Cold One Spear Riders, who are a similar deal to the previous unit, just they are anti-large, so they're going to be great at taking out other cavalries, and primarily I'd say that's what they're for. I wouldn't advise going after single entity large monsters or monstrous infantry because they don't have the melee defense to stand up to those, and you've got plenty of other choices to take out those units. And lastly, we have the Horned Ones, who are basically Cold One Riders on steroids. They have improved stats all across the board but are still mostly a shock cavalry with their slightly lower melee defense, so keep them on the cycle charge. They're also susceptible to rampage, so be a little bit careful with them lest they just go nuts. All this cavalry as well causes fear, which is great for that hammer and anvil tactic because it not only adds the leadership debuff from the fear, but also from the attacked in the rear penalty. Onwards then to our monstrous units, aka frickin' dinosaurs man. The Feral Bastillodon is basically a bus, and a reasonably priced one at that. I think most of these large dinosaur units are really designed to be used like chariots. Charge them around, keep them moving, this is how they can be most effective. They've clearly got a ton of armor, but they have low melee defense and low melee attack. The low melee defense is going to mean that they take a lot of damage, so keeping them on the move will keep them away from that, and because they have low melee attack, that can be buffed by the charge bonus, provided that you repeatedly charge them around and get that charge bonus. So use them like a chariot and they will serve you well. The Croxagores, your only monstrous infantry, and one of your better units for taking out heavily armoured infantry. As they have a ton of weapon strength, which is armor piercing and has a bonus versus infantry, they can do this relatively well. Where they fall down though is of course the melee attack. It's only 26, which isn't that great, so they're a unit that can really benefit from a melee attack buff. They also have sucky melee defense, so are probably best off mixed in with some Saurus warriors. And then there's the Revivification Crystal Bastillodon, who in melee is basically the same idea as the Feral Bastillodon, charge him around, use him like a chariot, but he does have a ranged attack which can do a bit of damage and is poison as well. But the main reason you'll be bringing this one along is for its Revivification Crystal of course, which allows you a healing spell basically, which you can use on any of your units in the army, and can also resurrect dead combatants as well, so it's going to add to your healing capabilities, which makes it a great support unit. It also comes with a couple of floating skinks, seemingly, and is the only one of these large dinosaur units that isn't susceptible to rampage, interestingly. And then we have the Feral Stegodon, who's basically the same idea as the Feral Bastillodon, he's just better at doing that job. He's got better stats all across the board, most notably a higher weapon strength and a massive charge bonus. And as with all these large dinosaur units, they have fear and terror, which is very useful and makes them far more effective in that chariot role, as they'll be constantly charging around applying that terror to any low leadership units. Very useful in the late game. And then we have the Feral Carnosaur, who would give 8-year-old me nightmares after watching Jurassic Park too many times. Luckily in this game though, he's more of an anti-large unit, so should be looking for those large targets, large single entity monsters, monstrous infantry, monstrous cavalry, or cavalry rather. The only big danger is that he's quite susceptible to go into rampage, especially if you leave him in melee combat too long, so do be careful with him, but he can be very powerful at taking down those large enemies. And then we've got the Solar Engine Bastillodon, who also comes with some magical floating skinks. It's primarily a short range artillery with nice missile damage, which has a debuff to enemy melee attack, melee defense and accuracy. It also has fire attacks and magical attacks as well, so it can hurt all kinds of targets. It's got that fear and terror too, so if all else fails, you can use it as a chariot unit and just charge it round to cause chaos. And then we've got another artillery dinosaur with the non-feral Stegodon. It's got better range than the Solar Engine, and its missile damage is armor piercing and poison, so it may want to have different targets than the Solar Engine. It still holds pretty much the same melee stats as the feral Stegodon, so it can still be charged around all over the gaff. Maybe the better of the two against heavily armoured factions. And then you've got the Ancient Stegodon, which is pretty much the same deal as the previous two, just it's a bit more tanky and a bit more powerful. It's got more missile damage but quite a bit less range, and plenty of melee stats to get that chariot style use on the go. This thing and the other two artillery style dinosaurs are basically like tanks. They're heavily armoured, they're quite slow but still mobile, and can dish out range damage and run over things. They're basically tanks. And as they're such high mass units, they can be very difficult for the enemy to stop. And lastly, we've got a couple of different kinds of Pterodon riders. This unit in general is a missile unit overall. It's not very good in melee at all and has very little armor, so it has to watch out for missiles itself. If you can keep them alive, they can drop some nice missile damage on the enemy, which is also poison, so could be great for flanking round and trying to shoot enemy front lines in the back to help your front line out. And then they have a bombardment ability to drop on the enemy, which can be very useful in the later game. And we've got the Fire Leech Bowler version of the Pterodon riders. They're very similar to the normal Pterodon riders, but instead of poison, they have fire attacks, which are explosive as well. So they do a bit of explosive damage, and they will knock troops around a bit too. So mostly a harassing and support unit really. They're not going to do a ton of damage, and they're by no means a superior air unit that can hold the skies against other air units really, but they can certainly have their flanking and harassing uses. Now, tactically, how can we think about the Lizardmen? Let's begin with their front line. They can have some pretty solid ones at that, because most of the time it's either going to be Saurus Warriors, maybe Saurus Warriors, but probably just Saurus Warriors to be honest. Nah, I'm only joking. You're just going to want to stick with Saurus Warriors. Truth is, they're the only choice for a front line. Whether it's shielded versions, non-shielded, spears, they're the only ones for the job. Skink Cohort simply aren't good enough. Temple Guard, really too expensive. So as I mentioned, Saurus Warriors with shields, really the best choice for a front line. They've got good holding power, they can put out the damage, and because it's only them, they're your only real choice, you don't really have to micro too much. You just charge them in and let them go to work, and chances are they'll go into rampage and you won't be able to control them anyway. Maybe if you're facing an army with a lot of large units, you want to switch them out for Saurus Spears with shields instead. That could be a good call, but for the most part you don't have to worry about the strength of your front line. It's always going to be pretty tanky and pretty good. The biggest threat to them is going to be high damage armor piercing units. So then, while your Saurus Warriors are charging up and doing what they can, it's going to be up to your large dinosaurs to charge around and cause absolute carnage throughout the enemy ranks. As they are high mass units, they usually have no trouble charging through an entire unit. This is fantastic for disrupting front lines. You can get after back lines and mess with missiles. You can charge into the back of the enemy front line to help your front line out. And they're very difficult to stop when they're charging around like this because they're such high mass. If the enemy isn't equipped with a lot of missile units, it's very difficult for them to stop these large units. And as I said, for the most part, using them like chariots is a better way to go. Charge them in, keep them going through the unit if you can. Maybe leave them there for a little bit and then take them away. They'll get their charge bonus, they can do some damage, and then they can move on before they take any real damage themselves. And their damage output will be a bit slower from playing like this, but it means they'll last a lot longer and will do tons more damage over time. And honestly, it's probably fine to leave them in combat at times, as long as the enemy unit isn't armor piercing or anti-large. But one other beauty of charging them around is that you get the chance to apply terror to enemy units and scare them off. And this can be a very powerful tactic for the Lizardmen, as most of these large units will cause terror. So another good reason to keep them moving and to keep them charging around. This is especially effective against lower leadership factions like the Skaven or the Beastmen, or in the late game when all the enemy units have been beaten up a bit and everyone's leadership is low. These units in the late game can be very dangerous with that terror ability. Another simple but very effective tactic for the Lizardmen is good old hammer and anvil, for a few reasons. Number one, their cavalry are just designed for it. Horned ones and cold one riders are great shock cavalries that can put out a lot of damage. Cold One Spear Riders are obviously more of an anti-large cav than a hammer and anvil cav, but feral cold ones again will benefit from being used in a hammer and anvil situation, so there's plenty of damage that can come from hammer and anvil. The second reason why it's a good tactic for the Lizardmen, their front line, their Saurus warriors will hold well, which means you've got plenty of time to bring your hammer, the cav, down onto the anvil, the Saurus warriors. And the last reason is probably the most important one, they can bring armor piercing to the front line, something that the Saurus warriors can't do. So this armor piercing hammer and anvil can be almost essential when facing heavily armored front lines, especially ones that have armor piercing like these Chaos with great weapons. They could defeat the Saurus warriors, so the Saurus warriors are going to need the help from the hammer and anvil, and you can see the difference it's making here, routing the two units that have been charged. So if you do bring cavalry along, look for that hammer and anvil, especially if your Saurus warriors are going to need it. Another powerful aspect of the Lizardmen game, which Lord Mazdamundi is very happy about, is all the Lizardmen's healing. There's a couple of actual healing spells like Apotheosis on some of the Lords, and Cold-Blooded, which is on all Lords and Heroes. Do be careful with the Cold-Blooded ability though, as it does reduce the melee attack and more importantly the melee defense of the unit being healed. So if they're in combat and they're taking damage, well, they're going to take more damage because they've got lower melee defense while they get healed, so it kind of negates the heal anyway. So best off trying to use Cold-Blooded on units that aren't in combat. And another big healing source is of course the Revivification Crystal Bastiladon, which is very simple to use. The beauty of a lot of this healing as well is that it doesn't take from your magic pool. Apply all this healing well and it can make the super tanky Lizardmen even more tanky. So keep an eye on your most important units, keep them healed up when they need it, and you can further improve that Lizardmen endurance. And while we're on the subject of magic, most of the Lizardmen lore books are pretty offensive spellbooks overall, but I find that buffs and debuffs can be some of the most powerful tools for the Lizardmen, specifically buffing certain units' melee attack. Kroxigors, for example, have really high weapon damage but pretty pathetic melee attack, meaning they don't really do as much damage as you'd expect for the price you're paying. So a buff that boosts them 20 odd melee attack can be very useful because they're a lot more dangerous with 52 melee attack than they are with 26 or whatever they have. So if you do want to bring Kroxigors in your army, maybe just one unit that you drop this buff on could be more useful than two units that you don't drop a buff on. The same is true of Cold One Spear Riders, low melee attack and low melee defense, drop the buff on them, that'll help them out a lot when they get into combat. Or you could drop a melee defense debuff on the enemy, which will have pretty much the same effect. This is of course a tactic for any faction really, but the low melee attack Lizardmen can benefit from this type of strategy. A powerful debuff throughout the Lizardmen army is poison as well. As I mentioned, skink skirmishers are a great flanker. They can put some poison in the back of the enemy front line, help those Saurus warriors out, or anywhere else around the battlefield as they're very quick. Mobility is not a problem for them. A skink chief on a pterodon is another nice mobile applier of poison as well. So that's a few tactical plans based on the Lizardmen's strengths, but what about their weaknesses? Well, armor piercing is a huge danger to the Lizardmen just like it is to the dwarves. So a small and powerful Saurus frontline can deal with a lot of frontline units, but an enemy armor piercing frontline, or worse, a heavily armored enemy armor piercing frontline, that's a lot of words, can spell utter doom for a Saurus frontline. So check the enemy frontline that's coming at you. If it has a lot of armor piercing, you're going to need to help those Saurus warriors out or they probably will lose. And the same goes for other sections of your armies. Your heavily armoured large monsters will either get destroyed or badly damaged by armour piercing anti-large units, so be sure to avoid those. Armour piercing missiles are a big danger for your large units, as they're such big targets they're easy to hit. Thunderers, dark shards, handgunners, these can all lay waste to large units very quickly. Artillery as well, warp lightning cannons, great cannons, very dangerous, accurate anti-large units. So, always err on the side of caution when there's a lot of armor piercing around. And lastly, one of the biggest problems for the Lizardmen, unsurprisingly, is rampage. Your unit loses control and in turn you lose control of it. It'll attack whoever it wants until it calms down. But it is somewhat predictable. When most units hit 50% health, this is when they go into rampage, so you can kind of see it coming. Although with some units, it seems to be when they take a lot of damage quickly. Either way, it can become very frustrating and difficult to manage your army. The biggest danger of Rampage is that it can leave your units in mismatches that are very bad for them. It may make your Saurus warriors charge into an armor-piercing anti-infantry unit. It can allow the enemy to switch out their units and put a bad matchup on them, so you could have a feral Bastiladon fighting Bleak Saws, let's say, which is fine, that's a good matchup for a Bastiladon, but then it goes into Rampage because it's been shot by missiles, and the enemy could pull their bleak swords away and send some Blackguard of Nagarond in, and that Bastiladon is going to get stabbed up pretty quick. So Rampage is a big problem, but there isn't a great deal you can do about it. You can try and heal units as much as possible before they hit 50% health, before they go into Rampage, but for the most part there isn't a great deal you can do about Rampage other than try to plan for it and expect units to go into Rampage and have something ready to save them if needed. But this is very difficult to do with all the micromanaging that needs to go on anyway. But for the most part, the tankiness of the Lizardmen does save them from this a little bit. But there we go, some of the main tactics I believe for the Lizardmen army. Now let's get into the build section where we'll drop a few different builds on a few different ways to play the Lizardmen. So first up, my build. It's going to go against the conventions of the Lizardmen as I have no real large chargy round crazy dinosaur units. I've gone infantry heavy, with the plan to overrun the enemy with numbers in a Skaven Beastmen or Greenskins style, with a couple cavalry on the side. This is more of an online build, great for surprising your opponent because everyone expects you to bring large monsters as the Lizardmen, and when you don't and you just bring tons of infantry and they've got loads of anti-large spearmen, well those spearmen usually get destroyed by Saurus warriors. So we're just going to charge up with the front line, try to get as much flanking as we can with these edge units if we outnumber them. I've got a little skink party on the left, which is skink cohort and skink skirmishers, and then on the right the cavalry will come round and try to hammer and anvil what it can. Overall, the build is a very simple one with very simple tactics. You charge in your front line, you don't have to think too much about it because you've got mostly all the same unit across the front line. And as I said, the plan here is to overrun the enemy, come around the flanks, they won't have enough units to stop us, and we can just run through them all over the place. These missiles are going to get chased down, this cavalry is going to get intercepted by my anti-large cavalry. See, these skink units are going to be great for chasing down missiles, disrupting them, getting rid of the artillery. My skink skirmishers can come up behind, start dropping some damage and some poison, more importantly in the back of the enemy front line, and then it's just a case of winning the war of attrition and outlasting the enemy with your sheer numbers of brutal, heavily armoured Saurus warriors. Trying to get some of that healing around. There are white lions in this army though, so that's pretty difficult for the Saurus warriors, but luckily we outnumber them, so we should be able to win 2 units to 1 against white lions. And it's just a case of churning our way through these units. White lions of course will lose melee defense after 50% health, and so the High Elves can't withstand this Lizardmen overrunning Skaven style rush, which makes it very fun to play in my opinion. I do love these kind of builds, that's why I'm throwing one of these in there, just to be a little bit different from what you might expect with lots of large dinosaurs in the roster. Try it, wield it, love it. Now to good old Ninja Hun's build, which I think is more of an army he's made on the fly rather than one of his pre-made builds. It's a front line of good old Saurus warriors with shields of course, some skink cohort to flank, and an anti-large cav to deal with any enemy cav, and then a bit of an anti-large core. He's got a Saurus Scar veteran on a Carnosaur, which is anti-large, he's got Lord Mazdamundi on an ancient Stegodon, and then a feral Carnosaur as well. And these 3 are going to form a sort of anti-large hit squad. And as he's facing the Tomb Kings, that's going to be very important with the single large entity powerful units of the Tomb Kings. So he's going to charge in with the Saurus warriors. They should do well against most of the Tomb Kings infantry, but there is a lot of large units which are going to be a problem. He's got his skink cohort coming around the side, they can provide some nice flanking support, some morale debuffs if anything, and then it's a case of trying to assassinate all these large units. He's trying to get a bit of damage done on the Lord before some halberds come over, and he's keeping these 3 large units together most of the time so they can all support each other. As this fight against the Tomb Kings, it becomes a little bit of a large unit fracas. He can use his monstrous squad as well to help support that front line as they may need it in certain areas. But for the most part, it's going to come down to who can kill whose monsters quicker, and 2 feral Carnosaurs are a great way to do that. You can use the spells and healing of Mazdamundi to help keep everything in the fight, and eventually whittle them down into submission. So this army is focusing on trying to whittle down those single entity large units while just charging your front line in, and not really having to worry about them too much. You can focus your micro on this large unit squad. A useful build if you're expecting to face a lot of large single entity units. And for my last build, the quirky build, I've gone the opposite end of the spectrum to my first build where it was all infantry. Now we've gone all monsters. I've got a front line of Cruxagors, 4 units of those. I've got a good amount of killing power in that, although of course lacking in the melee attack. On the flank, I've got a couple of large monsters and some cavalry, Revivification Crystal there as well. And Krokgar, just on foot, is my Lord. And then over on the left, more cavalry and a feral Carnosaur. And then for all my magic needs, Heaven's Priest on a Pterodon. I've named this my Jurassic Park build in my build section, as that's basically what it is. The downside of this is that it's a very risky build. It's very prone to mismatches. If there's a lot of anti-large, this front line of Kroxigors ain't gonna do shizzle. But against factions that have a lot of sword infantry and melee infantry like these Black Ark Corsairs, Kroxigors will have no problem with them. I can then use my large units to charge around and disrupt the missiles, prevent them from blasting my large units down, and my cavalry can sort out the enemy cavalry. And this build is really designed to put a lot of fast damage on the enemies, something the Lizardmen aren't really designed for. I can use my Revivification Crystal to heal up my Kroxigors as much as possible, try to keep them in good matchups. See, they're fighting Blackguard here, that's not good for them. But for the most part, the Kroxigors have been fighting Black Ark Corsairs and Dreadspears, who they've had an okay time against, and we've been able to rout. So, a fun build, a risky one though, that's why it's the quirky build, but give it a go, you just might enjoy it. Oh yes. So there it is, the Lizardmen guide. Many of you asked many times for it, and there you go. I now have no Warhammer 2 guides left to do, until of course Norsca is upon us. And yes, I will be doing a guide to Norsca. No, I haven't done one yet for Warhammer 2, because they're not in Warhammer 2. There's bound to be changes when they come into Warhammer 2, so there's no point making a version based on the Warhammer 1 version, because they'll just be wrong in Warhammer 2. Hopefully that makes some sense. And I'd like to encourage the rest of you to punish those who don't watch videos to the end, and who do ask me for a Norsca guide. If you see a comment asking for a Norsca guide, call that person a schlonghead. For me. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. I thank you for watching. I'll see you in the future.